Rain hammered against the cracked windows of the abandoned subway entrance, where Elena Vasquez sat hunched over her two sleeping children. Her worn jacket barely covered 6-year-old Mia and 8-year-old Carlos as they pressed close to her for warmth on the concrete floor. The cardboard boxes she had carefully arranged around them provided little protection from the November wind that whistled through the broken glass above. Elena's fingers, numb with cold, clutched a crumpled newspaper that someone had discarded earlier that day. She couldn't read the words in the dim light, but holding it gave her something to do besides count the hours until morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena had been living on the streets with her children for 8 months now, ever since the factory where she worked for 6 years suddenly closed without warning. The unemployment benefits had lasted only 3 months, and despite applying to dozens of jobs, no one wanted to hire someone without a permanent address. Her small savings had evaporated quickly between buying food for the children and trying to keep them in clean clothes for school. When the eviction notice came, Elena had packed their few belongings into 2 grocery bags and led Mia and Carlos out into a world that suddenly had no place for them. The children had adapted to their new reality with a resilience that both amazed and broke Elena's heart. Carlos, always the protector, had learned to spot the safest places to sleep and which dumpsters behind restaurants might yield edible food. Mia had become expert at staying quiet during the day when they needed to rest in public places without drawing attention. Both children had dark circles under their eyes from irregular sleep and the constant stress of uncertainty, but they rarely complained. They trusted their mother completely, believing that somehow she would find a way to make everything better. Elena's own faith in that possibility grew weaker each day. She had grown up in foster care after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7. She had aged out of the system at 18, with no family connections and few resources. Through sheer determination, she had managed to complete community college while working nights at a diner. She had built a modest but stable life, renting a small apartment and working steadily at the factory. When Mia and Carlos came into her life through the foster system when she was 25, Elena had felt like she was finally creating the family she had always dreamed of having. Now, sitting in the cold subway entrance, Elena wondered if she was failing her children in ways she could never undo. They deserved stability, warm beds, regular meals, and the security of knowing where they would sleep each night. Instead, she was giving them uncertainty, hunger, and the daily humiliation of being invisible to the people who hurried past them on the sidewalks. Elena had applied for assistance programs, but the waiting lists were long, and the requirements seemed designed to exclude people in situations exactly like hers. The rain began to ease as dawn approached, and Elena gently woke the children. They needed to be out of the subway entrance before the morning commuters arrived. Carlos stirred first, his brown eyes immediately alert and scanning their surroundings. He had learned to wake up ready to move quickly if necessary. Mia took longer to wake up, her small body reluctant to leave the warmth of sleep. Elena helped her sit up and smoothed her tangled hair with her fingers. "Are we going to the park today, Mama?" Mia asked in a sleepy voice. The park had become their daytime refuge, a place where they could sit on benches and the children could play on the equipment without anyone questioning their presence. "Yes, baby," Elena said, forcing her voice to sound cheerful. "We'll have breakfast first, though." Breakfast would be whatever they could find or afford. Yesterday, it had been half a bagel that someone had thrown away and a shared apple that Elena had bought with coins she had collected from strangers. They walked through the quiet streets as the city began to wake up around them. Elena kept the children close to her, their small hands warm in hers despite the cold morning air. She had memorized the locations of public restrooms where they could wash their faces and hands, and she knew which coffee shops might give them free cups of hot water. The children had learned to be patient during these morning routines, understanding instinctively that staying clean and presentable was important for their survival. As they approached Riverside Park, Elena noticed more activity than usual. Several large trucks were parked along the street, and workers were setting up what looked like a stage or platform near the main pavilion. Curious despite herself, Elena led the children closer to see what was happening. A banner stretched between two poles read Riverside Community Foundation Annual Benefit Concert. Men in work clothes were arranging chairs and testing sound equipment. "What's happening, Mama?" Carlos asked, his voice betraying the excitement that any unusual event brought to their routine days. "It looks like they're preparing for some kind of concert," Elena said, reading the smaller signs that were being posted around the area. The concert was scheduled for that afternoon, featuring local musicians and speakers raising money for community programs. Elena felt a familiar pang of sadness as she realized this was exactly the kind of event she might have attended in her previous life, maybe even volunteered to help with. A well-dressed woman with perfectly styled silver hair was directing the setup process. She wore an expensive camel-colored coat and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. Elena recognized the type from her factory days when corporate executives would occasionally visit the floor. This woman had the unmistakable bearing of wealth and authority. The woman noticed Elena and the children watching and walked over to them. Elena instinctively pulled the children closer, prepared to move away if necessary. She had learned that people in expensive clothes often meant trouble for people like them. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Victoria Sterling, chair of the Riverside Community Foundation. Are you planning to attend our benefit concert this afternoon?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question seemed absurd given their obvious circumstances. "We were just walking through the park," she said quietly, not wanting to explain their situation to this stranger. Victoria's sharp eyes took in Elena's worn clothing, the children's two small shoes, and the plastic bags they carried with their belongings. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more calculating than friendly. "I see. Well, the concert is free to attend, though we do encourage donations to support our community programs." Carlos tugged on Elena's sleeve. "Mama, can we listen to the music?" Before Elena could respond, Victoria stepped closer, studying the children with uncomfortable intensity. "These are your children?" "Yes," Elena said, her voice carrying a protective edge. She didn't like the way this woman was looking at Mia and Carlos, as if they were specimens to be examined rather than people. "How old are they?" Victoria asked, her tone becoming more pointed. "Carlos is 8, and Mia is 6, Elena replied, wondering why this stranger was asking such personal questions. Victoria nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected. "And I assume you're between homes at the moment." Elena felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger. She hated the euphemistic way people talked about homelessness, as if calling it something prettier made it less shameful. "We're managing," she said curtly, taking a step back. But Victoria wasn't finished. "You know, I've been involved in charitable work for over 20 years. I've seen countless families in situations like yours. The children always suffer the most, don't they? Growing up without stability, without proper education, without the advantages that other children take for granted." Elena felt a surge of protective rage. "My children are fine. They're loved and cared for." "Of course they are," Victoria said in a tone that suggested she didn't believe it at all. "But love doesn't provide warm beds or regular meals or a safe place to sleep, does it? Love doesn't give them the same opportunities as children from stable homes." Mia had been listening to this conversation with growing confusion and distress. She moved closer to Elena and whispered, "Mama, why is the lady saying mean things?" Victoria heard the whisper and smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "I'm not being mean, sweetheart. I'm being realistic. Your mother wants to take care of you, but sometimes wanting something isn't enough." Elena had heard enough. "Come on, kids. We need to go." She started to turn away, but Victoria's next words stopped her cold. "I have a proposition for you. Victoria said, her voice carrying the tone of someone making a business deal. I'm always looking for ways to demonstrate the effectiveness of our Foundation's programs. If you can prove to me that you have what it takes to provide for these children properly, I'll consider sponsoring them myself. Elena turned back, her heart beginning to race despite her better judgment. What do you mean? Victoria gestured toward the stage being constructed. We're featuring several musical performances today. I happen to know that one of our scheduled performers specializes in classical violin. If you can play violin well enough to impress me and our audience, I'll adopt both of your children and give them the life they deserve. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Adopt my children? You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Victoria said, her eyes glittering with something that might have been malice or amusement. Think about it. I have resources, connections, the ability to provide them with private schools, music lessons, college educations, everything you'll never be able to give them. All you have to do is prove that you have some exceptional talent that might justify keeping them in their current situation. Elena stared at this woman in disbelief. You're asking me to give up my children for a musical performance? I'm offering your children a chance at a real future. Victoria corrected. The performance is simply a way to determine whether you have anything exceptional to offer them yourself. If you can't even play a simple piece of violin music, what hope do you have of providing them with the advantages they need to succeed in life? Carlos had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm. At 8 years old, he understood enough to know that this strange woman was talking about taking him and Mia away from their mother.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mama, I don't want to go with her, he said, his voice small and frightened. Victoria knelt down to Carlos's eye level, putting on what she probably thought was a warm smile. Carlos, wouldn't you like to have your own bedroom, and toys, and all the food you want whenever you're hungry? I want to stay with Mama, Carlos said firmly, moving behind Elena's legs. Victoria stood up and brushed imaginary dirt off her expensive coat. Children don't always know what's best for them. That's why adults have to make difficult decisions sometimes. She looked directly at Elena. You have until this afternoon to think about it. The concert starts at 3 o'clock. If you can find a violin and play Pachelbel's canon in D well enough to satisfy me and the audience, I'll let you keep your children. If you can't, or if you don't even try, I'll be making some phone calls to social services about the conditions these children are living in. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. You're threatening to call social services. I'm pointing out that children living on the streets are in danger, and it's every citizen's responsibility to report such situations to the proper authorities, Victoria said smoothly, unless of course their mother can demonstrate that she has exceptional abilities that might change their circumstances. With that, Victoria turned and walked back toward the stage setup, leaving Elena standing in the park with her children, her heart pounding and her mind reeling. The casual cruelty of what had just happened was almost beyond comprehension. This wealthy woman had just threatened to destroy Elena's family unless she could perform an impossible task. Mama, what did that lady mean? Maya asked, tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. Elena knelt down and pulled both children into a fierce hug. She's just a mean person, baby. Don't worry about her. But Elena was worrying enough for all three of them. She had never played violin in her life. She had no idea where she would even find one, let alone learn to play a complex classical piece in a matter of hours. The task was absurd, impossible, clearly designed to be a humiliating failure. Yet as Elena held her children and felt their small bodies trembling with confusion and fear, she knew she had to try. Victoria Sterling might have meant her challenge as a cruel joke, but Elena couldn't afford to treat it as anything less than a fight for her family's survival. The morning sun was climbing higher, warming the park slightly as the concert preparation continued around them. Elena watched the workers setting up chairs and testing microphones. each activity a reminder of the deadline that now hung over her head. 6 hours to find a violin. 6 hours to learn a piece of classical music. 6 hours to save her children from being taken away. Elena had faced impossible odds before. She had survived the foster system, put herself through college, and built a life from nothing once already. She had kept her children fed and safe for 8 months on the streets, when many people would have given up. She was stronger than Victoria Sterling realized, and more resourceful than her current circumstances suggested. But this challenge was different. This wasn't about endurance or determination, or making do with less. This was about mastering a skill she had never attempted, performing in front of strangers, and somehow convincing a room full of people that a homeless woman deserved to keep her children. Elena stood up and took her children's hands. "Come on," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have things to do today." "Where are we going, Mama?" Carlos asked. Elena looked around the park, at the city beyond it, at the countless possibilities and obstacles that lay ahead of them in the next 6 weeks. "We're going to find a way," she said simply. As they walked away from the concert setup, Elena's mind was already racing through possibilities. She needed to find a violin, someone to teach her the basics, and somehow acquire enough skill to perform in public. It seemed impossible, but Elena had learned that impossible was just another word for something that required more creativity and determination than most people were willing to invest. The first step was finding a violin. Elena knew there were pawn shops in the downtown area, and maybe music stores that rented instruments. She had $17 in her pocket, money she had been saving for emergency food for the children. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to rent an instrument for a day. The second step was learning to play it. Elena had no musical training, but she had always been a quick learner. She remembered hearing classical music in movies and on television, and she had a good sense of rhythm from years of dancing to the radio while she cleaned house. Maybe, with enough focus and practice, she could learn the basics of holding a violin and making it produce recognizable sounds. The third step was performing in front of Victoria Sterling and her audience. This was the part that scared Elena the most. She had never been comfortable being the center of attention, and the thought of standing on a stage while people judged her ability to keep her children made her stomach twist with anxiety. But as Elena walked through the city streets with Mia and Carlos, she felt a familiar determination building inside her chest. She had been underestimated before. People had looked at her and seen a foster kid with no family, a single mother with no resources, a homeless woman with no options. Each time she had found a way to prove them wrong. Victoria Sterling thought she was offering an impossible challenge to a desperate woman who would fail publicly and then surrender her children without a fight. But Victoria Sterling didn't know Elena Vasquez. She didn't know about the years of foster homes that had taught Elena to adapt quickly to new situations. She didn't know about the factory job that had taught Elena to work with her hands and follow complex instructions. She didn't know about the strength that came from loving 2 children more than her own life. Elena squeezed her children's hands as they walked, feeling their trust and confidence in her flowing through their intertwined fingers. Carlos and Mia believed she could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. For their sake, Elena was going to believe it too. The downtown area was busy with morning traffic and pedestrians hurrying to work. Elena felt invisible among them, just another person moving through the city with purpose. But today, her purpose was different than theirs. Today she wasn't just trying to survive until evening. Today she was fighting for the right to keep her family together. The first pawn shop they found was already open, its neon sign flickering in the window. Elena took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The children closed behind her. Inside, the shop was cluttered with everything from electronics to jewelry to musical instruments. Behind the counter, a heavy-set man with graying hair looked up from a newspaper. "Help you with something?" he asked, his tone neither friendly nor unfriendly. "I'm looking for a violin," Elena said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Something I could rent for just 1 day." The man studied her carefully, taking in her appearance and obvious lack of money. "We don't do rentals," he said. "You buy it or you don't." Elena felt her heart sink, but she pressed on. How much would a violin cost? The man gestured toward a corner of the shop where several instruments hung on hooks. "Depends on what you want. Got a student model there for $75. Not great quality, but it makes noise. $75 might as well have been 75,000. Elena looked at the violin hanging in the corner, so close and yet completely out of reach. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to leave. "Wait," the man called out. Something in Elena's voice or expression had caught his attention. "What do you need it for?" Elena hesitated. The truth sounded too strange to be believable. "I need to play in a concert this afternoon." The man raised his eyebrows. "You a musician?" "No," Elena admitted. "I'm learning to play violin in one day." The man's tone was skeptical but not unkind. "That's ambitious." Elena felt tears threatening and fought them back. She couldn't afford to break down now, not in front of the children. "It's important," she said simply. The man looked at Elena for a long moment, then at Carlos and Mia standing quietly beside her. Something in their tired faces and worn clothes seemed to register with him. "Tell you what," he said finally. "You can borrow that student violin for the day. Bring it back tonight and we'll call it even." Elena stared at him in shock. "Really? You'd let me borrow it?" "My daughter took violin lessons when she was about their age," the man said, nodding toward the children. "Never got very good at it, but she sure tried hard. I respect people who try hard." He walked over to the corner and took down the violin case.
This comes with a bow and some rosin. You know what rosin is? Elena shook her head. It's this cake of stuff that you rub on the bow to make it grip the strings better, the man explained, opening the case and showing her the contents. The violin's already tuned, more or less. Try not to drop it. Elena accepted the case with hands that shook slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. Just bring it back in one piece," the man said gruffly. But Elena could see kindness in his eyes. "And good luck with your concert." Outside the pawn shop, Elena set the violin case down carefully and opened it. The instrument inside was scratched and worn, but to Elena it looked beautiful. The wooden body gleamed dully in the sunlight, and the strings stretched taut over the fingerboard, looked impossibly thin and delicate. "Is that really a violin, Mama?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "It really is," Elena said, carefully lifting the instrument out of the case. It was lighter than she had expected, and holding it felt awkward and unfamiliar. "Now we need to find someone who can teach me how to use it." Carlos had been unusually quiet during the conversation in the pawn shop, but now he spoke up. "Mama, why do you need to learn violin?" Elena looked at her son's serious face and made a decision. Carlos was 8 years old enough to understand at least part of what was happening. Mia might be too young for the full truth, but Carlos deserved to know why this day was so important. "Remember that lady in the park? The one who said mean things?" Elena asked. Carlos nodded. "She wants to take you and Mia away from me unless I can prove that I can take good care of you. She said, if I can play violin music for her, she'll let us stay together." Carlos's eyes grew wide with alarm. "She wants to take us away, but we don't want to go with her." "I know, baby. That's why I'm going to learn to play this violin. I'm going to show her that we belong together, no matter what." Carlos stepped closer to Elena and put his small hand on the violin case. "I'll help you, Mama. We'll learn together." Mia, not fully understanding the conversation but sensing its importance, nodded seriously. "I'll help too." Elena felt a surge of love for her children so strong it almost brought her to her knees. They were offering to help her with something they didn't fully understand, simply because they trusted her and wanted to stay together as a family. She would do anything to protect that trust and keep them safe. "Okay," Elena said,
closing the violin case and standing up. "Let's go find someone who can teach us about violins." They walked through the downtown area, looking for music stores or anywhere else that might have people who knew about violins. Elena's mind was racing through everything she had ever heard about the instrument. She knew that violins were played with a bow drawn across the strings, and that different finger positions on the neck created different notes. She knew that classical music required precision and practice, and that most people spent years learning to play well. But Elena also knew that she didn't need to become a virtuoso. She just needed to play one song well enough to convince Victoria Sterling that she deserved to keep her children. Pachelbel's canon in D might be a complex piece, but Elena was determined to find a way to make it work. The first music store they found was closed, with a sign indicating it wouldn't open until noon. The second was open but filled with electric guitars and drums, with no acoustic instruments in sight. The third was a small shop specializing in sheet music and accessories, but the elderly woman behind the counter admitted she didn't know much about actually playing instruments. Elena was beginning to feel desperate when Carlos spotted a small sign in a coffee shop window: "Live acoustic music every morning 10 a.m. to noon." Through the window they could see a young man with shoulder-length brown hair sitting on a small stage area, playing guitar and singing folk songs for the handful of customers eating breakfast. "Maybe he knows about violins," Carlos suggested. Elena looked at the musician through the window. He appeared to be in his 20s, with the casual appearance of someone who made his living through music rather than a traditional job. It was worth a try. Inside the coffee shop, the atmosphere was warm and relaxed. The musician was finishing a song as Elena and the children found seats at a small table near the stage. His voice was pleasant and his guitar playing skillful, though Elena could tell he was performing more for tips than for any serious artistic purpose. When he finished the song, Elena approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "I was wondering if you might know anything about violins." The musician looked up with friendly brown eyes. "A little bit. I play guitar mostly, but I studied violin for a few years when I was younger." "Are you looking for lessons?" "Something like that," Elena said, glancing at her children. "I need to learn to play one specific song by this afternoon." "I know it sounds crazy, but it's really important." The musician raised his eyebrows. "This afternoon? That's not much time. What's the song?" "Pachelbel's Canon in D." The musician whistled low. "That's a beautiful piece, but it's not exactly beginner level. How much violin experience do you have?" "None," Elena admitted. The musician looked at Elena more carefully, taking in her appearance and the serious expressions on her children's faces. "Okay, I have to ask, what's this really about? People don't usually need to learn classical violin in a matter of hours, unless there's something unusual going on." Elena hesitated, then decided that honesty might be her best approach. Briefly, she explained about their homelessness, the encounter with Victoria Sterling, and the challenge that had been issued. The musician listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as Elena told her story. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment, processing what he had heard. "That's one of the cruelest things I've ever heard," he said finally. "Using your children as leverage to humiliate you in public. What kind of person does that?" "The kind of person who thinks homeless people don't deserve to keep their families," Elena said bitterly. The musician stood up and extended his hand. "I'm Jake Morrison, and I think we need to teach you some violin, fast." Elena shook his hand gratefully. "I'm Elena Vasquez. These are my children, Carlos and Mia." "Nice to meet you all," Jake said, smiling at the children. "Elena, I have to be honest with you. Learning to play Pachelbel's Canon in D in a few hours is probably impossible, but maybe we can figure out a way to make it work anyway." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. Jake thought for a moment. "The full canon is pretty complex, but there are simplified versions,
And if you're just trying to demonstrate that you can play violin, maybe we can focus on the most recognizable part of the melody. It won't be perfect, but it might be enough. Elena felt a flicker of hope. You think it's possible? I think it's worth trying, Jake said. Let me see the violin. Elena opened the case, and Jake examined the instrument carefully. It's not a great violin, but it's playable. The tuning is off though. He took out his phone and opened an app, then carefully adjusted each string until the violin was properly tuned. Okay, let's start with basics. For the next 2 hours, Jake worked with Elena in the coffee shop, teaching her how to hold the violin properly, how to draw the bow across the strings to create clear sounds, and how to place her fingers on the fingerboard to make different notes. Elena was a quick learner, but the violin was unlike anything she had ever tried to master. The bow kept slipping in her hands, creating scratchy, unpleasant sounds instead of the smooth tones she heard when Jake demonstrated. Her fingers cramped from holding them in unfamiliar positions, and her neck ached from supporting the violin in the correct position. Several times Elena felt like giving up, but each time she looked at Carlos and Mia, watching her with complete faith in her abilities, she found the strength to keep trying. Jake was a patient teacher, breaking down each element of violin playing into manageable steps. He showed Elena how to use her whole arm to move the bow, rather than just her wrist, how to apply the right amount of pressure to create clear tones, and how to position her left hand to find the correct notes quickly. You're actually doing pretty well, Jake said after Elena managed to play a simple scale without any scratchy sounds. You have good instincts for this. Elena wiped sweat from her forehead.
It doesn't feel like I'm doing well. My arm is killing me. That's normal. Violin uses muscles you're not used to working. The important thing is that you're getting the basic technique down. Jake picked up his phone and played a recording of Pachelbel's Canon in D. Listen to this melody line. This is the part we're going to focus on. The familiar classical melody filled the coffee shop, beautiful and complex and seemingly impossible for Elena to replicate. But as she listened, Jake hummed along with the main theme, helping her identify the most important melodic phrases. We're not going to try to play the whole thing, Jake explained. We're going to focus on this opening section, maybe the first 30 seconds. If you can play that cleanly and recognizably, it should be enough to prove your point. Jake spent the next hour teaching Elena the finger positions for the first phrase of the canon. It required her to move between several different notes quickly and smoothly, something that felt almost impossible at first. But gradually, Elena began to understand the pattern, and her fingers started to remember where they needed to go. Carlos and Mia had been watching this process with fascination and patience that amazed Elena. They sat quietly at their table, occasionally offering encouragement, but mostly just observing their mother's struggle to master this new skill. "Mama, you're getting better," Mia said during a break when Elena was massaging her sore fingers. "It sounds like real music now." "Thanks, baby," Elena said, managing a smile despite her exhaustion. "I'm trying. You sound like the lady on TV who plays violin," Carlos added. "The one in the long dress." Elena laughed. "I don't think I'm quite that good yet, but thank you." By noon, Elena could play the opening phrase of Pachelbel's Canon recognizably, though not smoothly. Her fingers still fumbled occasionally, and her bow control was inconsistent. But the basic melody was there, and Jake assured her that with another hour or two of practice, she could probably perform it adequately. "You need to keep practicing," Jake said as he packed up his guitar. "The muscle memory isn't quite there yet, but you're close. Practice the finger positions without the bow first, just getting your left hand comfortable with the movements. Then add the bow work." Elena felt panic rising in her chest. "You're leaving, but I still can't play it properly." "You can play it," Jake said firmly. "Maybe not perfectly, but well enough." "Elena, what you've accomplished in 3 hours is actually pretty amazing. Most people take weeks to get to this point. But what if I mess up? What if I can't do it when I'm on stage with everyone watching? Jake put his hands on Elena's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. Elena, that woman is hoping you'll fail. She's counting on you being too intimidated or too unskilled to even try. The fact that you're going to get up there and play anything at all is going to surprise her. Elena nodded, trying to absorb his confidence. What if it's not enough? What if she says I didn't play well enough? Then you'll have shown everyone in that audience what kind of person she really is, Jake said. And you'll have shown your children that their mother never gives up, no matter what. After Jake left, Elena and the children spent another hour in the coffee shop. Elena practiced the violin quietly, running through the finger positions over and over until her left hand began to remember the pattern automatically. The bow work was still inconsistent, but she was managing to produce clear tones most of the time. At 1 o'clock, Elena realized they needed to head back to the park. The concert started at 3, and she wanted time to prepare mentally for what was coming. She carefully packed the violin back in its case, thanking the coffee shop owner for letting them stay so long. The walk back to Riverside Park felt like a march toward an execution. Elena's stomach was churning with anxiety, and her hands shook slightly as she carried the violin case. Everything she had worked for over the past few hours was about to be put to the test in front of strangers who would judge whether she deserved to keep her children. The park was busier now, with people arriving early for the concert. The stage was fully set up, with professional sound equipment and rows of chairs arranged in front. A banner reading Riverside Community Foundation hung prominently behind the performance area. Elena found Victoria Sterling near the stage, talking with several other well-dressed people who were clearly part of the foundation's leadership. Victoria was wearing the same expensive coat as that morning, and her silver hair was perfectly styled. She looked every inch the successful philanthropist, someone accustomed to making decisions about other people's lives. Elena, Victoria said when she spotted them approaching. I wondered if you would actually show up. Do you have a violin? Elena held up the case without speaking. Her throat felt too tight to form words. Excellent, Victoria said, her smile sharp and predatory. I've arranged for you to perform right after our opening remarks. The audience should be at its largest then, which will give you the best opportunity to demonstrate your abilities. How many people are you expecting? Elena managed to ask. Oh, probably 200 or 300, Victoria said casually. This is one of our most popular annual events. People come for the music and to support our various charitable programs. Her emphasis on the word charitable made it clear she didn't consider Elena's situation worthy of charity. Elena felt dizzy. She had been imagining performing for a small group, maybe 20 or 30 people. The thought of standing in front of hundreds of strangers while trying to play a violin she had just learned was terrifying. Mama, are you okay? Carlos asked, noticing her distress. Elena knelt down and hugged both children tightly. I'm scared, she admitted quietly, but I'm going to do this anyway, because you two are worth fighting for. We believe in you, Mia whispered. You're the best mama in the world, Carlos added. You can do anything. Their faith in her was both heartbreaking and strengthening. Elena stood up and faced Victoria Sterling with as much dignity as she could muster. I'll be ready when you are. Victoria's smile widened. Perfect. I'll introduce you to the audience myself. I'll make sure they understand exactly what's at stake here. As Victoria walked away, Elena realized that this woman intended to make her performance as humiliating as possible. She would probably tell the audience about Elena's homelessness, frame the challenge as a test of whether Elena deserved to keep her children, and set Elena up to fail in front of everyone. But Elena also realized something else. By making this challenge so public, Victoria had created an opportunity. If Elena could somehow succeed, if she could play well enough to impress the audience, then Victoria would be the one who looked cruel and heartless.
The very public nature of the challenge that was meant to humiliate Elena might actually work in her favor. Elena found a quiet spot near the back of the seating area and opened the violin case. She had about an hour before the concert started, and she intended to use every minute of it practicing. Her fingers moved through the opening phrase of Pachelbel's canon over and over, sometimes with the bow and sometimes with the bow and sometimes without, building muscle memory and confidence. Several early arrivals noticed her practicing and gathered to listen. Elena felt self-conscious at first, but gradually she realized that people seemed genuinely interested in her playing. A few even offered encouragement, telling her it sounded beautiful or asking what piece she was working on. The elderly man's question about performing hung in the air as Elena looked up from her violin practice. She had been so focused on getting the fingering right that she hadn't noticed him approaching. His weathered face showed genuine interest, not the mixture of pity and judgment she had grown accustomed to seeing from strangers. "I'm going to perform it this afternoon," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least I'm going to try." "How wonderful," the man said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I'm Harold Kensington. I've been coming to these foundation concerts for years. The music is always exceptional." He paused, studying Elena's worn clothing and the obvious nervousness in her posture. "Is this your first time performing publicly?" Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak without her voice shaking. "Well, Canon in D is certainly ambitious for a debut performance," Harold said gently. "But I can tell you've been practicing hard. The fingering looks quite accurate from what I observed." "You play violin?" Elena asked, surprised. "I taught music for 43 years before I retired," Harold explained. "High school orchestra mostly, but I gave private lessons as well. Would you mind if I listened while you practice?"
Sometimes a second pair of ears can be helpful. Elena felt a surge of gratitude mixed with terror. Having a real music teacher listen to her amateur attempts felt both like a gift and a potential humiliation, but she needed all the help she could get.
"I'd appreciate that," she said.
"But I should warn you, I only started learning this morning. I'm not very good yet." Harold's eyebrows rose in surprise. "This morning? You learned Pachelbel's canon this morning?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Just the opening section, and not very well. May I ask why you're attempting to learn such a complex piece in one day?" Elena glanced at Carlos and Mia, who had been playing quietly nearby, but were now listening to the conversation with worried expressions. She had already told Jake Morrison the truth, and it had resulted in genuine help. Maybe honesty was the best approach with Harold as well. Briefly, Elena explained the situation with Victoria Sterling and the challenge that had been issued. Harold listened without interrupting, his expression growing more grave as Elena described the morning's encounter. "That's unconscionable," Harold said, when Elena finished. "Using children as pawns in some sort of social experiment. I've known Victoria Sterling for years through these foundation events. She's always been cold and calculating, but this exceeds even her usual cruelty." "You know her?" Elena asked. "Unfortunately, yes. She's been the Foundation's chair for the past decade, and she runs it like a personal fiefdom. Everything has to be done her way, and she has very specific ideas about who deserves help and who doesn't." Harold shook his head in disgust. "But this situation is different. She's threatening children." Elena felt a flicker of hope. "Do you think she'll really follow through? Would she actually call social services?" Harold considered this carefully. Victoria Sterling is nothing if not vindictive. If she's made a threat, she'll likely follow through unless she gets what she wants. But here's what she doesn't understand about public performances at foundation events. "What do you mean?" "These audiences are largely made up of donors and community supporters. They come because they believe in helping people, not because they want to see someone humiliated. If you get up there and play, even imperfectly, and the audience understands what's really happening, Victoria might find herself facing more opposition than she bargained for." Elena felt her heart rate increase. "But what if I can't play well enough? What if I make mistakes or it sounds terrible? Harold stood up and moved to face Elena directly. My dear, I've taught thousands of students over the years. I've heard every possible mistake that can be made on a violin. And I can tell you this, technique matters, but heart matters more. If you get up there and play with genuine feeling, if people can see that you're fighting for something important, they'll respond to that regardless of a few wrong notes. Do you really think so? I know so. But let me help you prepare as best we can. Harold sat back down and gestured toward the violin. Show me what you've learned so far. Elena lifted the violin to her shoulder, conscious of Harold's professional scrutiny. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned the bow, and she took a deep breath before beginning the opening phrase of the canon. The first few notes came out clear and true, and Elena felt a moment of confidence. But as the melody progressed into the more complex passages, her fingers fumbled, and the bow skipped across the strings, producing harsh scratching sounds instead of music. Stop, Harold said gently, when Elena reached the end of the phrase. That was actually quite good for someone who started this morning. Your basic technique is sound, which is remarkable, but there are a few adjustments we can make that will help significantly. For the next half hour, Harold worked with Elena on bow control and finger placement. He showed her how to use her wrist more effectively, to create smooth bow strokes, and how to press her fingers more firmly against the fingerboard to ensure clean notes. The violin is an unforgiving instrument, Harold explained as Elena practiced a particularly difficult passage. Every small imperfection in technique is audible, but that also means that small improvements in technique make a big difference in the sound. Under Harold's guidance, Elena's playing improved noticeably. The scratchy sounds became less frequent, and the melody began to flow more smoothly. She was still far from professional quality, but the music was becoming recognizable and even pleasant to listen to. Much better, Harold said after Elena played through the opening section without any major mistakes. Now let's work on expression. Music isn't just about hitting the right notes at the right time. It's about telling a story, conveying emotion. How do I do that? Think about what this piece means to you. What story are you trying to tell with this music? Elena considered the question. I guess I'm trying to tell the story of fighting for my family, of not giving up even when everything seems impossible. Perfect. Now play it again, but this time think about that story. Let the emotion of that fight come through in your playing. Elena lifted the violin again and began the canon. This time, instead of focusing solely on technique, she thought about Carlos and Mia, about the months they had spent homeless, about the fear of losing them, and about the determination that had brought her to this moment. The music that emerged was still imperfect, but it had a quality it hadn't possessed before. There was urgency in the faster passages and tenderness in the gentler sections. Elena could feel the difference, and she could see in Harold's face that he heard it too. Excellent, Harold said when she finished. That's the difference between playing notes and making music. Hold on to that feeling when you perform this afternoon. As they talked, more people had begun arriving for the concert. The chairs in front of the stage were filling up, and Elena could see Victoria Sterling moving among the crowd, greeting people, and no doubt preparing them for whatever spectacle she had planned. I should probably find somewhere to warm up before the performance, Elena said, looking at the growing crowd with increasing nervousness. Actually, Harold said, I have a suggestion. There's a small rehearsal space in the community center building adjacent to the park. It's where performers usually prepare before foundation events. You could have some privacy to practice and collect yourself. Elena felt grateful for the suggestion. The thought of continuing to practice in full view of the arriving audience was becoming increasingly stressful. Harold led Elena and the children to a modest brick building at the edge of the park. Inside, a small room contained a piano and several chairs, clearly designed for musicians to prepare for performances. The space was quiet and calm, a welcome contrast to the busy activity outside. I'll leave you to practice in peace, Harold said. But Elena, before I go, I want you to know something. What you're doing today takes tremendous courage. Regardless of the outcome, you should be proud of yourself for fighting for your children." After Harold left, Elena sat alone in the rehearsal room with Carlos and Mia. The violin case lay open beside her, and the reality of what she was about to attempt began to sink in fully. In less than an hour, she would be standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, playing an instrument she had just learned, fighting for the right to keep her children. "Mama, are you scared?" Mia asked, climbing onto Elena's lap. "Yes, baby, I'm scared," Elena admitted. "But sometimes we have to do scary things to protect the people we love." Carlos moved closer and put his hand on Elena's arm. "What if that mean lady doesn't think you play good enough?" Elena had been trying not to think about that possibility, but Carlos's question forced her to confront it. What would happen if Victoria Sterling declared her performance inadequate? Would social services really be called? Would Carlos and Mia be taken away that very day? "Then we'll figure out what to do next," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But right now, I need to focus on playing the best I can. That's all any of us can do in any situation, our best with what we have." Elena spent the remaining time practicing the canon repeatedly, running through the melody until her fingers began to remember the patterns automatically. She practiced with the bow and without it, focusing on smooth transitions between notes and maintaining steady rhythm. At 2:45, a young man with a clipboard appeared at the rehearsal room door. "Are you Elena Vasquez, Miss? Sterling asked me to let you know that you'll be performing in about 10 minutes.
Elena's stomach dropped. 10 minutes. The opening remarks are just finishing up. You'll go on right after the introduction. Elena nodded, trying to appear calmer than she felt. "Thank you." After the man left, Elena carefully packed the violin and bow back in their case. Her hands were shaking now, and she could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. "It's time," she told the children. They walked together toward the stage area, Elena carrying the violin case and the children staying close to her sides. The crowd had grown significantly, with easily 200 people seated in the folding chairs and more standing at the back. Elena had never performed for an audience of any size, let alone one this large. Victoria Sterling was standing at the microphone on stage, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. She wore the same expensive coat as that morning, and her posture radiated confidence and authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria was saying as Elena and the children approached the stage area, "today we have a very special performance for you. Elena Vasquez, a member of our community, has requested the opportunity to demonstrate her musical abilities for our foundation audience." Elena could hear the subtle mockery in Victoria's tone, the way she emphasized certain words to suggest that Elena's performance would be amusing rather than serious. Several people in the audience turned to look at Elena, taking in her worn clothing and obvious nervousness. "Miss Elena Vasquez has informed me that she learned to play violin just this morning," Victoria continued, and Elena heard murmurs of surprise and confusion from the audience. "She'll be performing Pachelbel's Canon in D, which, as many of you know, is a quite challenging classical piece." Victoria's introduction was clearly designed to set Elena up for failure, to make the audience expect amateur fumbling rather than serious music. But Elena also noticed that some people in the crowd looked confused or concerned by Victoria's tone. Harold had been right about foundation audiences wanting to support people rather than see them humiliated. "The circumstances of this performance are rather unique," Victoria continued, and Elena realized with growing horror that Victoria intended to explain the entire situation to the audience. "Miss Vasquez approached me this morning with her 2 children, Carlos and Mia." Victoria gestured toward the children, and Elena felt a surge of protective anger at having them made part of this public spectacle. "As you can see, the family is currently experiencing housing challenges," Victoria said, her euphemistic language making Elena's homelessness sound like a minor inconvenience rather than a daily struggle for survival. "Vasquez believes that demonstrating musical talent will somehow address their situation."
Elena could see people in the audience looking uncomfortable now. Victoria's introduction was making it clear that something unusual and potentially cruel was happening, but the exact nature of the situation remained unclear. Vasquez that if she could play violin well enough to impress our audience today, I would personally ensure that Carlos and Mia receive the opportunities and advantages they deserve, Victoria concluded. So let's welcome Elena Vasquez and see what she can do. The applause was polite but confused. Elena could see people whispering to each other, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Victoria stepped away from the microphone and gestured for Elena to take the stage. Elena's legs felt unsteady as she climbed the few steps to the platform. The audience looked enormous from the stage, faces staring at her with curiosity and expectation. She had never felt so exposed or vulnerable in her life. With trembling hands, Elena opened the violin case and lifted out the instrument. The afternoon sun was warm on the stage, and she could feel sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool November air. She positioned the violin against her shoulder the way Jake and Harold had taught her, trying to remember all the technical details while managing her overwhelming nervousness. The bow felt slippery in her sweating palm, and she had to adjust her grip several times before it felt secure. Elena looked out at the audience and saw Harold Kensington sitting in the third row, his kind face encouraging. She saw other faces that looked sympathetic and interested rather than judgmental. And she saw Victoria Sterling standing to the side of the stage, her expression expectant and slightly amused. But most importantly, Elena saw Carlos and Mia standing at the edge of the stage area, their small faces full of love and faith in their mother. They believed she could do this impossible thing, and that belief gave Elena the strength to lift the bow to the strings. The first note of Pachelbel's canon rang out clear and true, carrying across the park with surprising clarity. Elena felt a moment of relief and confidence as she moved into the second measure, her fingers finding the correct positions and the bow producing smooth, even sounds. The opening phrase of the canon was the section she had practiced most intensively, and muscle memory began to take over. Elena's nervousness didn't disappear, but it receded enough to allow her to focus on the music rather than the audience. As the familiar melody unfolded, Elena began to hear it differently than she had during practice. The notes seemed to carry more weight and meaning when played for people who were listening intently. She could feel the audience's attention focused on her, and gradually she realized that people weren't waiting for her to fail. They were hoping for her to succeed. The canon built to its most complex passage, the section that had given Elena the most trouble during practice. Her fingers moved carefully across the fingerboard, finding each note with deliberate precision. A few notes came out slightly flat or sharp, but the melody remained recognizable and beautiful. Elena found herself thinking about the story Harold had encouraged her to tell through the music. This wasn't just a classical piece anymore. It was the sound of a mother fighting for her children, the melody of determination in the face of impossible odds, the harmony of love that refused to give up. As she played, Elena became aware of how quiet the audience had become. The whispered conversations and shuffling movements had stopped, and people were listening with complete attention. Even Victoria Sterling's smug expression had been replaced by something that might have been surprise. The canon reached its gentle conclusion, the final notes floating across the park before fading into silence. Elena lowered the violin and bow, her heart still racing but now with exhilaration rather than pure terror. For a moment the audience sat in complete silence. Elena wondered if this meant she had failed, if her performance had been so amateur that people didn't know how to respond. Then Harold Kensington began to applaud, and within seconds the entire audience had joined him. The applause wasn't polite or obligatory. It was genuine and enthusiastic, the sound of people who had been moved by what they had heard. Elena stood on the stage, clutching the violin and trying to process what had just happened. She had done it. She had actually played Pachelbel's canon in D in front of hundreds of people, and they were applauding. But more importantly,
She could see in Victoria Sterling's face that something unexpected had occurred. Victoria had clearly expected Elena to fail embarrassingly, to prove that homeless people didn't deserve to keep their children. Instead, Elena had delivered a performance that was genuinely moving and impressive. The applause continued for what felt like several minutes, with some people rising to their feet. Elena saw tears in several faces in the audience, and she realized that people understood the significance of what they had just witnessed. Finally, Victoria Sterling stepped back to the microphone, her composed expression not quite concealing her surprise and displeasure. "Well," Victoria said, her voice tight, "that was certainly unexpected. Vasquez has demonstrated that with sufficient motivation, anyone can learn basic musical skills." Elena could hear Victoria trying to minimize what had just happened, to frame it as a simple demonstration of rudimentary ability, rather than the extraordinary achievement it actually was. But before Victoria could continue, Harold Kensington stood up in the audience. "If I may," Harold called out, his voice carrying clearly across the park. "I'm Harold Kensington, and I taught music in this community for over 4 decades. What we just heard was not basic musical skills. Vasquez learned that piece in a single day, and she played it with genuine artistry and emotion." Harold's words seemed to give other audience members permission to speak up. "That was beautiful," called out a woman from the middle section. "I've heard professionals play that piece. And this was just as moving." "What's this really about?" asked a man from the back. "Why is this woman being put through some kind of test?" Elena could see Victoria's carefully planned humiliation beginning to backfire. The audience was responding with sympathy and admiration for Elena, rather than judgment and condescension. "The circumstances are complicated," Victoria said, trying to regain control of the situation. "But I think we can all agree that Miss Vasquez has demonstrated admirable determination." "That's not an answer," said another voice from the crowd. "What happens now? You said something about ensuring her children receive opportunities." Elena realized that Victoria was being forced to address her promise in front of the entire audience. Whatever Victoria's original intentions had been, she now had to respond publicly to Elena's successful performance. "Of course," Victoria said, her smile looking forced, "Miss Vasquez has certainly exceeded my expectations. I'll be speaking with her privately about how the foundation can assist her family." But Elena could see that many people in the audience weren't satisfied with Victoria's vague response. The mood of the crowd had shifted from polite attention to active engagement and concern. Perhaps, Harold called out again, "Miss Vasquez could tell us herself what kind of assistance would be most helpful." Elena found herself with the microphone being offered to her by someone from the audience who had climbed onto the stage. She had never spoken publicly before, but she realized this might be her only chance to advocate for herself and her children. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice shaking as it was amplified across the park. "I want to thank everyone for listening today. This morning, I didn't know how to play violin at all. I learned because Miss Sterling told me that if I could play well enough to impress her, she would adopt my children." A murmur of shock went through the audience. Elena could see people's expressions changing as they understood what had really been happening. "My children and I have been homeless for 8 months, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. "We lost our apartment when the factory where I worked closed down. I've been trying to find steady work and stable housing, but it's difficult when you don't have an address."
Elena looked down at Carlos and Mia, who were watching her with proud smiles. Carlos and Mia are amazing children. They're smart and kind and resilient. They deserve better than sleeping in subway entrances and wondering where their next meal will come from. But they also deserve to stay with someone who loves them unconditionally, which I do. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on Elena's every word. "I don't need anyone to adopt my children," Elena said, looking directly at Victoria Sterling. "I need help finding a job and an apartment so I can take care of them myself." I need people to see us as a family worth helping, not as problems to be solved by separating us." The applause that followed Elena's words was even more enthusiastic than what had greeted her musical performance. People stood up, cheering and calling out words of support and encouragement. Victoria Sterling looked like she had swallowed something bitter. Her carefully orchestrated demonstration of superiority over homeless people had instead become a public relations disaster that cast her as a villain threatening to separate a loving family. But the afternoon was far from over, and Elena had no idea how Victoria would respond to this unexpected turn of events. The audience's sympathy was gratifying, but Elena still needed concrete help to change her family's circumstances. As the applause died down and people began to approach the stage, Elena realized that her violin performance had been just the beginning of something much larger and more complicated than she had anticipated. A woman with short gray hair and kind eyes was the first to reach Elena as she stepped down from the stage. "I'm Janet Morrison," the woman said, extending her hand. "I run the Employment Services program at the community center. I'd like to talk with you about job opportunities." Behind Janet, several other people were waiting to speak with Elena. Elena saw business cards being pulled from purses and wallets, phones being opened to contact information screens, and the unmistakable signs of people wanting to help. Elena called out a tall man in a casual suit. "I'm David Chen, and I manage rental properties downtown. I might have some housing options that could work for your family." Elena felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention and offers of assistance. After months of being ignored or dismissed by potential employers and landlords, the idea that multiple people wanted to help her simultaneously was almost too much to process. But she also noticed that Victoria Sterling was standing nearby, clearly listening to these conversations with growing displeasure. Elena realized that Victoria might try to interfere with any help being offered, possibly by following through on her threat to call social services. "Miss Sterling," Elena said, approaching the foundation chair directly, "you heard me play. You saw the audience's response. I think I fulfilled your challenge." Victoria's smile was cold and calculating. "You played adequately. I'll give you that. But adequately isn't the same as impressively, and the challenge was to impress me specifically, not to win sympathy from a crowd." Elena felt her heart sink. She had known that Victoria might try to move the goalposts, but she had hoped that the public nature of the performance would make it harder for Victoria to simply declare her a failure. "You said if I could play well enough to impress you, you'd adopt my children," Elena said. "I don't want you to adopt them, but you also said you'd ensure they received the opportunities they deserve. Staying with their mother who loves them is what they deserve." "That's your opinion," Victoria said. "But I'm not convinced that sleeping in subway stations and living off charity is providing them with adequate opportunities." Harold Kensington had been listening to this exchange, and now he stepped forward. "Victoria," Harold said, his voice carrying decades of authority as an educator, "I've known you for years, and I've watched you make many questionable decisions as foundation chair. But what you're doing today crosses a line that I never thought you'd cross." "Harold, this doesn't concern you," Victoria replied. But Elena could hear uncertainty in her voice. "It concerns everyone here," Harold said, gesturing toward the crowd of people still gathered around the stage. "You used this foundation event to set up a public humiliation of a homeless family. You threatened to separate children from their mother unless she performed for your entertainment, and now that she's exceeded every reasonable expectation, you're trying to renege on your commitment." Other people in the crowd began to voice their agreement with Harold's assessment. Elena could see Victoria looking around nervously as she realized that public opinion was turning strongly against her. Furthermore, Harold continued, "I think the foundation board should hear about how you've been conducting yourself today. Using foundation resources to pursue personal vendettas against vulnerable families is hardly what our donors expect from their charitable contributions." Victoria's face had gone pale. Elena didn't understand all the implications of what Harold was saying, but she could see that he had struck a nerve. "You're overreacting, Harold," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. This was simply a demonstration of how determination and effort can overcome obstacles. "No," said Janet Morrison, stepping up beside Harold. "This was cruelty disguised as charity. And I think a lot of people here are going to remember this when it comes time to make future donations to the foundation." Elena watched this confrontation with growing amazement. These people, most of whom had been strangers to her an hour ago, were standing up to Victoria Sterling on her behalf. The violin performance had somehow transformed her from an invisible homeless woman into someone worth defending. "Elena," said David Chen, the property manager who had approached her earlier, "why don't we move away from here and talk about practical next steps? I think you've proven your point sufficiently." Elena nodded gratefully, but as she started to move away with Carlos and Mia, Victoria Sterling called out one more time. "Miss Vasquez," Victoria said, her voice sharp with anger, "I hope you understand that there will be consequences to what happened here today. People in your situation can't afford to make enemies of people in mine." The threat was clear, even though Victoria had been careful not to state it explicitly. Elena felt a chill of fear, knowing that Victoria Sterling probably had connections and influence that could make her family's life even more difficult. But Harold Kensington stepped between Elena and Victoria, his face stern with decades of moral authority. "Victoria," Harold said quietly, "I suggest you be very careful about your next words. This entire conversation has been overheard by dozens of witnesses, and I suspect several people have been recording it on their phones. Any further threats against this family will be documented and reported to appropriate authorities." Victoria looked around and realized that Harold was right. Multiple people had their phones out, and the hostile attention of the crowd was focused entirely on her. She had maneuvered herself into a position where any further cruelty would be captured and shared widely. Without another word, Victoria Sterling turned and walked quickly away from the stage area, her expensive coat billowing behind her as she retreated. Elena felt her knees go weak with relief. The immediate threat was over, though she suspected Victoria's anger would find other outlets in the future. But for now, Elena was surrounded by people who wanted to help rather than harm her family. "Are you all right?" asked Janet Morrison, noticing Elena's shaken expression. "I think so," Elena said. "I just can't believe what happened. This morning I was just trying to survive until evening, and now you have options," Janet said firmly. "Real options for changing your situation, and you have people who want to see you succeed." David Chen had been talking quietly with several other people, and now he returned to Elena with what looked like a small committee of potential helpers. "Elena," David said, "we've been discussing your situation, and we think we can put together a package of assistance that could get your family back on its feet fairly quickly." Elena felt almost dizzy with hope and disbelief. "What kind of assistance?" "Well, I have a small 2-bedroom apartment that's been vacant for a month," David explained. "The rent is reasonable, and I'd be willing to waive the security deposit and accept a gradual payment plan for the first month's rent while you get established. And I have job openings at the community center," Janet added. "Administrative work primarily, but it's full-time with benefits. The pay isn't huge, but it's steady and the hours are compatible with the children's school schedule." A woman Elena hadn't met yet stepped forward. "I'm Linda Rodriguez, and I run a child care program at the elementary school. Carlos and Mia could enroll immediately, and we have after-school programs that would cover the time between school ending and your work ending." Elena looked at these people offering to transform her family's circumstances, and she felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." "We know enough," Harold said gently. "We know you're a mother who loves her children enough to learn violin in one day to protect them.
We know you have the strength and determination to keep your family together under the most difficult circumstances, and we know that everyone deserves a chance to build a stable life. Plus, added Janet with a smile, you just gave one of the most moving musical performances I've ever heard. Anyone with that kind of heart and determination deserves support. Elena looked down at Carlos and Mia, who had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement and hope. Does this mean we get to have our own apartment? Carlos asked. It sounds like it might, Elena said, hardly believing the words as she spoke them. With our own beds, Mia added. With your own beds, David confirmed, smiling at the little girl's excitement. As the afternoon sun began to angle lower through the trees, Elena found herself sitting on a park bench surrounded by people making lists and plans for her family's new life. Phone numbers were exchanged, appointments were scheduled, and concrete steps were outlined for moving from homelessness to stability.
The violin case sat beside Elena on the bench, a reminder of the morning's impossible challenge that had somehow become the key to unlocking a future she had barely dared to imagine. But even as Elena felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the kindness of strangers, she couldn't shake the memory of Victoria Sterling's parting words. She had made an enemy today, someone with wealth and influence who didn't appreciate being publicly humiliated. Elena suspected that Victoria's anger would find expression somehow, and she would need to be prepared for whatever retaliation might come. But for the first time in months, Elena felt like she had allies, people who would stand with her against whatever challenges lay ahead. As the crowd began to disperse, and the immediate excitement of the afternoon started to fade, Elena realized that her real work was just beginning. She had proven that she could rise to an impossible challenge when her children's welfare was at stake. Now she needed to prove that she could build a stable, secure life for her family with the opportunities she had been given. The violin had served its purpose, transforming her from invisible homeless woman to someone worth helping. But the music had been just the beginning of a much longer and more complex composition, one that Elena would be writing with her actions and choices in the days and months to come. 6 months after that transformative afternoon in Riverside Park, Elena Vasquez stood in the kitchen of her 2-bedroom apartment, preparing breakfast while soft violin music drifted from the living room. The morning sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating a space that had become everything she had dreamed of during those cold nights in the subway entrance. Carlos had discovered an unexpected passion for the instrument that had saved their family, and his daily practice sessions filled their home with melodies that reminded Elena every morning of how far they had traveled. Harold Kensington had offered to give Carlos lessons for free, and under his patient instruction, the boy was progressing rapidly. Elena's job at the Riverside Community Center had proven to be more than just employment. Janet Morrison had become both supervisor and mentor, helping Elena develop administrative skills she never knew she possessed. The work involved coordinating community programs and serving as a liaison between the center and various social service agencies. Elena found deep satisfaction in helping other families navigate the same systems that had once seemed impossible to her. "Mama, I can almost play that song you played," Carlos called from the living room, his fingers working carefully through a simplified version of Pachelbel's canon. Mia wandered into the kitchen wearing her school uniform, her dark hair neatly braided. At nearly 7 years old, she had blossomed in the stable environment of their new life. The anxious expression that had marked her face during their months on the streets had been replaced by natural curiosity and playfulness. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Victoria Sterling had made several attempts to undermine Elena's new stability, filing complaints with child services and trying to have Elena dismissed from her job. But Harold Kensington and the network of supporters from that day had rallied around the family, providing character references and legal support when needed. More importantly, Elena had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. The determination that had driven her to learn violin in one day had carried over into every aspect of her new life. She had enrolled in evening business classes, determined to advance beyond her current position. She had learned to advocate not just for her own family, but for other families facing similar struggles. The community center had started a program called Second Chances, designed to help homeless families transition to stable housing. Elena had become the program coordinator, drawing on her own experience to create services that actually addressed people's real needs rather than bureaucratic requirements. Mrs. Rodriguez said, "We're learning about famous musicians today," Mia announced, climbing onto her chair at the small dining table. "I want to tell her about you, Mama, about how you learned violin in one day." Elena smiled at her daughter's pride. The story of that afternoon had become something of a legend in their neighborhood, but Elena was grateful that Carlos and Mia remembered it as a story of triumph rather than trauma. At the community center, Elena's desk overlooked the park where her life had changed so dramatically. She could see the pavilion where she had performed, now used regularly for community events that Elena often helped coordinate. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now worked closely with the same foundation that Victoria Sterling had once chaired. Victoria had been quietly removed from her position 3 months after the concert incident, following an investigation into her misuse of foundation resources and inappropriate treatment of beneficiaries. The new board had asked Elena to serve on their community outreach committee, recognizing her unique perspective on the challenges facing vulnerable families. "Elena, there's someone here to see you," Janet Morrison said, appearing in Elena's office doorway with an unusual expression on her face. Elena looked up from the grant application she was reviewing to see a well-dressed woman with graying hair standing nervously behind Janet. The woman looked familiar, but Elena couldn't immediately place her. "I'm Patricia Whitman," the woman said, stepping forward hesitantly. "I was in the audience that day when you played violin. I've been wanting to speak with you ever since." Elena remembered her now. Patricia had been one of the people who had stood and applauded most enthusiastically after Elena's performance. "Please sit down," Elena said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What can I do for you?" Patricia sat down carefully, clutching a manila folder in her hands. "I own Whitman Music Academy downtown. We provide private music lessons and have a small scholarship program for talented students who can't afford lessons." Elena nodded, wondering where this conversation was heading. "After hearing you play that day and learning about your story, I realized how many talented people never get the chance to develop their abilities because of circumstances beyond their control," Patricia continued. "I want to expand our scholarship program significantly, and I'd like you to help me design it." Elena felt her pulse quicken with interest. "What kind of help are you looking for? You understand better than anyone what barriers prevent people from accessing music education. You know what kind of support makes the difference between someone giving up and someone succeeding. I want to create a program that doesn't just provide free lessons but addresses all the obstacles that keep people from being able to take advantage of those lessons." Patricia opened her folder and pulled out several pages of notes and plans: transportation, instrument rental, flexible scheduling for people with irregular work hours, childcare during lessons for parents, even basic needs support when necessary. "I want to create something comprehensive." Elena studied the papers, seeing ideas that resonated deeply with her own experience. "This looks incredibly thoughtful. What made you think of me for this?" "Because you lived it," Patricia said simply. "You know what it feels like to have talent but no opportunities. You know what it takes to overcome impossible obstacles, and you've proven that you can turn personal experience into effective programming for others." Over the next hour, Patricia outlined her vision for what she was calling the Elena Vasquez Music Opportunity Program. She wanted to start with 20 scholarship recipients and grow from there, with Elena serving as program director and primary liaison with community organizations. "I'd want you to identify potential students, design the support services and oversee the program's implementation," Patricia explained. "It would be a part-time position initially, but with the goal of growing into something much larger." Elena felt excitement building as she considered the possibilities. "When would you want to start?" Immediately if you're interested. I've already secured funding for the first year, and I have board approval for the program design you helped me develop. That evening, Elena shared Patricia's offer with Carlos and Mia over dinner. The children were excited about the possibility of their mother working with music students, and Carlos was particularly thrilled at the idea that other children might get the same opportunities Harold had given him. Does this mean you'll stop working at the community center? Mia asked, concerned about any change to their newly stable routine. I don't think so, Elena said. Mrs. Morrison and I talked about it this afternoon. I could do both jobs at least at first. The music program would be mostly evenings and weekends when you two are free to come with me sometimes. Elena had learned to be cautious about major changes, but this opportunity felt different. It was a chance to use her experience in a new way, to help other people discover abilities they might never have known they possessed. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the main studio of Whitman Music Academy, watching 12 children and 3 adults attempt their first violin lesson. The students ranged in age from 7 to 55, and they came from backgrounds as diverse as Elena's own journey had been. There was Miguel, a construction worker who had always dreamed of playing classical music but had never been able to afford lessons. There was Sarah, a teenage foster child who had been moved between homes so frequently that she had never been able to commit to any long-term activities. There was James, a veteran struggling with PTSD, who had been told that music might help with his anxiety. Remember, Elena told the group as they positioned their violins for the first time, you're not competing with anyone except yesterday's version of yourself. Every note you learn, every song you master, is an achievement worth celebrating. She thought about her own first lesson with Jake Morrison in that coffee shop, how impossible everything had seemed at the beginning. Now she was standing in a professional music studio, teaching others what she had once thought was beyond her reach. As the lesson progressed and tentative musical sounds began to emerge from the group, Elena felt the same sense of possibility that had carried her through that desperate day 6 months ago. Music had saved her family, but more than that, it had taught her that transformation was always possible for people willing to work for it. The scholarship program grew rapidly beyond Patricia's original plans. Word spread through community organizations, social services agencies, and by simple word of mouth. People who had never considered music education suddenly saw it as attainable, and Elena found herself coordinating lessons for dozens of students within the first 3 months. More importantly, Elena had discovered her true calling. She wasn't just teaching music, she was teaching people to believe in their own potential. Every student who played their first complete song reminded Elena of her own moment of triumph on that park stage. Victoria Sterling's attempt to humiliate a homeless mother had instead created a ripple effect of opportunity and hope that continued to expand. Elena often wondered if Victoria understood how thoroughly her cruelty had backfired, how her effort to prove that some people didn't deserve chances had instead created chances for dozens of people. As Elena locked up the music academy after a particularly successful evening of lessons, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman learning violin to save her children. Now she was a program director, community advocate and teacher who had turned her darkest moment into a source of light for others. The violin case she carried now contained her own instrument, purchased with money from her new position. She had continued taking lessons with Harold, partly for her own enjoyment, but mainly to stay connected to the music that had transformed everything. Elena drove home through the city streets, past the subway entrance where she had once huddled with her children, past the pawn shop where a kind stranger had trusted her with a borrowed violin, past the park where she had faced her greatest challenge and discovered her greatest strength. Carlos and Mia were asleep when she arrived home, but Elena could see evidence of their thriving everywhere. Carlos's latest violin pieces were spread across the coffee table, and Mia's art projects covered the kitchen counter. Their backpacks sat ready by the door for another day of school, filled with homework and permission slips and all the ordinary challenges of childhood that Elena had once feared they might never experience. Elena sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop to review applications for the next round of music scholarships. Each application represented someone's hope for transformation, someone's belief that their circumstances didn't have to define their possibilities. As she read through the stories of people seeking chances to discover their own potential, Elena smiled at the beautiful irony of her situation. Victoria Sterling had challenged her to prove she deserved to keep her children. Instead, Elena had proven that everyone deserved chances to discover what they were capable of achieving. The music that had saved Elena's family was now saving others, creating a symphony of second chances that grew stronger with every student who learned to believe in themselves. And in the quiet of her warm kitchen, surrounded by evidence of her children's security and happiness, Elena knew that the most beautiful music was the sound of people refusing to give up on themselves and each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.